'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking
From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring the legend of Bigfoot meets science. That's right, we're going to be with Dr. Jeff Meldrum. He is Professor of Anatomy and Anthropology at Idaho State University, and he's going to help us out to look at this mystery of Bigfoot in a scientific way. Thank you very much for being on the circle, Dr. Meldrum.
Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, before we actually get into Bigfoot, we're going to explore also Sasquatch and Yeti, and those are all distant cousins, but we'll get to all that later. I wanted to see if we can start off on how did man evolve?
Well, sure. Well, over the past several decades, especially the fossil record of human evolution has grown in leaps and bounds, and there's just really no getting around the fact that our prehistory is littered with numerous hominid species that fill that perceived gulf between us and the animal kingdom. Oftentimes evolution is portrayed as simply man evolved from apes or man evolved from chimps, and that's far too simplistic. That's not what evolution says, but evolution does assert that we shared with chimpanzees a common ancestor, and one that probably looked a bit more like a chimpanzee than as we appear today. So we did evolve from hominid ancestors that became bipedal, that increased in brain size and in dexterity, and began to use tools, and established a material culture, and then language and complex social structure, and all the things, all the accoutrements that we associate with the genus Homo, leading up to the emergence of modern Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago.
And just for clarity, what is a hominid?
Right. Well, a hominid, and in fact, to be more precise, we should say hominin. A hominin is a member of the tribe, a taxonomic category, the tribe Hominini, which includes us and all of our extinct relatives, our ancestors directly, and some side branches, some cousins that emerged since the separation from the common ancestor shared with chimpanzees and gorillas. In the past, the term hominid had been used, but as systems of classification have changed over time and have been refined with new ideas, hominidae now includes us and our closest relatives amongst the great apes, the African apes, the chimp and gorilla.
Now, I'm going to be honest about this. I have a hard time saying these words, so I'm not really going to try. But can you give us the 5 stages? If I remember, Ardipithecus, I think was the...
Ardipithecus?
That's the one, Ardipithecus. They say that's the first one that we have of record, and then we kind of evolved?
Yeah, some say that. Ardipithecus is a remarkable fossil ape that there remains controversy over whether it's justified to single out Ardipithecus as a direct ancestor to the early hominids, rather than recognizing it as one of many apes that existed during the Miocene epoch. I mean, there was a time when the Earth really was the planet of the apes. Apes were extremely diverse and numerous, many different species, dozens of species of what are now extinct apes, and a variety of habitats and adaptations. Some were hanging and swinging from the trees like modern day orangutans and chimpanzees. Some were much more terrestrial like gorillas, and some inhabited woodland forests and grasslands, and some deep tropical forests and so forth. But much of the evolution of that ape radiation took place in the subtropical to temperate latitudes, deciduous forests across Europe and Central Asia. So what we know of apes today as represented by chimps, gorillas, and orangs is just a fraction of both taxonomic and ecological diversity that once existed. And Ardipithecus, because of the remarkable completeness of that skeleton, has received tremendous attention. And one way to center attention on a fossil is to dub it as the heir apparent to the title of human ancestor. And so there still remains some controversy. It's still fascinating. I'm undecided, but many of the things that have been said I think are unjustified. And it certainly wasn't a committed biped. It was a facultative biped.
What does that mean?
That means just as a chimpanzee is capable of standing up on its hind legs and walking around or carrying things in its hands for periods of times, although it doesn't show the remarkable adaptations for long-term committed bipedalism that the human spine and pelvis and foot exhibit. Ardipithecus was much more similar in many ways to the anatomy exhibited by a chimpanzee in the lower extremity and pelvis than we are. And so it's a little, it sort of stretches credulity to simply accept it as the first hominid ancestor. But it certainly is a fascinating species and raises a lot of questions. Is bipedalism the distinguishing characteristic that distinguishes hominids? Or were there pre-bipedal hominids, ones that were on our lineage exclusively, ancestral to our lineage, giving rise to modern humans?
Any evidence for that?
Oh, sure. I think there is. I mean, and that's why the debate rages on. I mean, if it was clear-cut one or the other, there wouldn't be the consternation and dialogue that carries on with it.
Among professors, never.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, yeah, we have some lively conversations. I teach a course in human evolution, and the textbook I use, and we augment with some of the documentaries that have kind of gone over the top in one direction or another, and then I motivate the students to kind of pick these discussions, these debates apart, and get down to the nuts and bolts of what the arguments are based on and what the merits of them are, one versus the other.
Now, I know there's Homo sapiens. There's one before us.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the name. Homo
Heidelbergensis?
I think that was it. How did we go from there to here?
Well, Heidelbergensis it's kind of a taxon, a species that's in a little bit of limbo. Some feel that we're simply looking at a little more advanced, slightly more advanced Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, the types that were found in Africa and Asia respectively immediately prior to Heidelbergensis. But Heidelbergensis, whatever the merits of its taxonomy are, this was a form, a very large, very robust, heavily skeletonized, or heavy skeleton. There's a better way to express it, and very muscular, very muscular form that was apparently the antecedent to both us and Neanderthals, and now maybe Denisovans, and maybe even another species or two out there that are yet to be recognized. But by about 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had distinguished themselves from, or were distinct from, Heidelbergensis in their gracilization, in their lightening of the skeleton. So instead of everyone walking around looking like NFL linebackers on steroids, they looked like marathon runners. We gave up that bulk of muscle mass and heavy skeleton that probably served our ancestors very well in their contests with large game animals perhaps, and just muscling their way through the environment to a body form that it was literally a lean, mean running machine. Endurance, running and walking became the way, and then and more sophisticated projectile weapons and a much more complex tool kit allowed us to make use of the environment with our wits, actually much more than our brawn. and much more efficient movement through the environment, covering greater distances, trading resources, pursuing game, herd animals, and so forth.
And actually, I'm going to talk. I have several other questions, but I know people are going to be disappointed if we don't start with Bigfoot on this show. So I'll leave these questions for part 2. So let's start looking at Bigfoot now.
Right.
Where does he fit in these categories of evolved humans?
Well, there's a couple of possibilities, and I entertain two, hypotheses, two potential explanations. The one that the first that was popular amongst many different researchers was the Gigantopithecus model. That is, we have an ape in the form of this thought to be extinct species that inhabited Eastern Asia, that's the right size in the right place at the right time to be an interesting or a potential ancestor, a candidate as an ancestor for Bigfoot and for the Chinese Yeren and other forms of Sasquatch-like creatures scattered across Eastern Asia, Eastern and Central Asia. The other possibility is that, and those that would look at bipedalism as a seminal adaptation, a seminal innovation that only evolved once. And if that were the case, then Sasquatch being bipedal would, and sharing that characteristic, would have to be part of our family tree since the divergence from the non-bipedal ancestors, or relatives like chimpanzees and their kin. But when you look at Sasquatch, it certainly, I cannot look at the characteristics and the behaviors and see something that is very human-like. Since the advent of Homo, the genus Homo, 2.5 million years ago, those species with that of that genus have all been characterized with stone tools, a material culture that became ever more sophisticated, and reduction in tooth size concomitant with those that proliferation of tools, increase in brain size, and then ultimately this gracilization of the skeleton that I talked about. Whereas Sasquatch shows those adaptations that were common to species prior to the emergence of Homo. Bipedalism, small brain, no consistent tool use. So one possibility would be Paranthropus, or robust Australopithecines. And it is remarkable. I've used in presentations a figure I composed where I juxtaposed a skull, a fairly complete skull of Australopithecus boisei, or Paranthropus boisei, one of the East African robust Australopithecine form, against a close-up of Paddy from the Patterson-Gimlin film. And the alignment of the landmarks of that skull with the bust of Paddy is remarkable. From the tip of her head, her brow, her orbits, her nose, her the occlusal plane of her teeth, her jaw. Everything just lines up. What it shows is, in short, is this distinctive adaptation where the robust Australopithecines were pursuing a very different adaptation to the gracile Australopithecines. The gracile led to tool use, reduced dentition size, and reduced jaws in ever-increasing brain size, whereas the robust Australopithecines kept that fairly small brain, that gorilla-sized brain, or slightly larger, but got this extremely massive face and all of the buttressing that was necessary to provide support attachment for these massive chewing muscles.
And this is what Sasquatch probably is?
That's a very likely possibility in my mind. Now, Gigantopithecus was an ape that also went that same direction, got a flatter face, deeper jaws, gigantic molars and premolars, very reduced canines and incisors. So in many ways, and other researchers have pointed to this, Gigantopithecus and the robust Australopithecines are remarkably parallel to one another. They're very convergent in their evolution of this massive chewing apparatus. It seemed like there were two sides to the coin, and you could pursue one adaptation or the other if you were a hominid, or some combination of the two, perhaps. But usually there was this separation of the niche, of the hominid niche, into those that were bigger brained, smaller toothed, and used tools, versus those that were smaller brained, bigger jawed and toothed, with very thick enamel, and weren't reliant on tools to manipulate, collect, and process the resources they needed to survive.
That's
So
fascinating.
either one of those would
sorry?
I was just going to say, either one of those would be good. Gigantopithecus, the right size, right place, right time, but we don't know for sure if it was bipedal because we only have jaws and teeth, although there's some interesting things to kind of point to bipedalism. And then robust Australopithecines, but they were thought to have gone extinct 2.5 million years ago in Africa. They're only 5.5 to 6 feet tall. So wrong size, wrong place, wrong time, and except they're bipedal, and show these adaptations of the face that are similar. So I would have, for a long time, my opinion tipped in the direction of Gigantopithecus. But then we had the discovery of Homo floresiensis, the hobbit. And so here was a species that ultimately, as I had predicted in my initial reviews of the paper, was much more Australopithecine-like. It was not a dwarfed Homo erectus. And so here you had something that was a very late Australopithecine, very, very early Homo, or very, very early Homo, that was all the way to the far side of the planet from where they were thought to have originated in Africa, without leaving any trace in between. So suddenly the prospect of a robust Australopithecine making its way out of Africa across Asia, maybe increasing body mass, body size, and then ultimately becoming the ancestor of Sasquatch, it wasn't so far-fetched after all. I mean, it was not that it was that far-fetched. I mean, if you haven't learned to never say never in this field, then you haven't been paying attention.
And life in general.
Yeah.
That was fantastic stuff. We got a good understanding of human evolution. We touched a little bit about Bigfoot to tease the crowd, but in part 2, we're actually going to find out more about Bigfoot. We're going to try to flesh him out and see what he possibly could look like. Why is he still around? So we're going to ask questions like that. And then I'm going to challenge Dr. Meldrum and ask him, are we still evolving?
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Part 1 was really good. We learned the background, a little bit about human evolution. We found out maybe where Bigfoot could be coming from, but today we're going to try to flesh him out. What does he look like? Who is this man or woman or whatever he may be? So I guess the first question is, what do we know about what he looks like?
Well, first of all, we should be speaking in the plural rather than singular. It's not a single lone monster roaming around the countryside, but it is a species of higher primate. And amongst the casts that I have, there are what appear to be males and females based on their proportions and dimensions, as well as small infants and juveniles. So it's a breeding population of large primates scattered across the habitat. So I think that they are, as we talked about in part 1, they're either large apes, a distant cousin of a gorilla or a chimp, that resembles us simply in their convergent evolution of the habit of walking on 2 legs, bipedalism, or they are a very early offshoot of the human family tree from a time when we were separated from our cousins by this unusual habit of walking on 2 legs and all that goes with it in its various forms and adaptations. Bigfoot would seem to have retained the massive, heavy body form, heavily muscled and heavy skeleton that allows it to literally muscle its way through the environment.
And you see that from the casting?
Well, sure. The breadth to length ratios of the Sasquatch foot separated out cleanly from human proportions, and that's an adaptation to accommodate the massive size. Not only its tall height, but its massive bulk. It has a very heavy body form by comparison to us, eyewitnesses. And obviously, now there's going to be some variation, just as there are variations in human physique in modern populations across the world. But witnesses sometimes describe leaner individuals, and these could be subadults, for example. If you saw a juvenile or a teenage, if you will, gorilla compared to the big silverback in charge of the group, when they come into their own, when that testosterone really kicks in, they bulk up and become heavier. And I'm sure the same types of physiological changes and morphological changes occur in Bigfoot as well.
Let me ask you this question. You're an expert on bipedalism, which is walking on, what's the definition for that again? 2 feet?
Yeah, walking on 2 feet.
Okay. You've seen the Patterson film probably once or twice, I'm assuming?
Oh, yeah, at least. At least that.
Does it reflect, or does it represent, better said, what you would think Bigfoot would walk like?
Oh, it does. If I had nothing but the footprints from that site, and the luxury of looking at the feet of that subject, I would be absolutely convinced that it's the real thing. As is the case with any population, one individual might not necessarily be a worthy caricature or stereotype of that entire species. And so she, right off the bat, is a female, and that may indicate some differences in height, in bulk, also perhaps in hair coverage. There seems to be, eyewitnesses who describe things that are very similar to what we see on the Patterson-Gimlin film. Then there are others who describe individuals who almost sound like Cousin It, covered with very long hair. I've talked to witnesses who've described the hair hanging off of the arms as being akin to the fringe on a buckskin coat. Or there was a great example in Dr. Bindernagel's book of a witness describing the Sasquatch they saw as if it was wearing a rain poncho that had been shredded by running through the vegetation, through the brush.
Which he might have, I guess.
Well, that's possible. Yeah, it could have been a case of mistaken identity, but I think what we're seeing is more likely just a contrast between the genders. Just like when you look at say orangutan males versus females, the females have fairly uniform length hair over their body and shorter. The males will have this long cape, and it hangs off of the arms in a fashion very similar to what I've just described for the Sasquatch, as witnessed by.
Well, I guess the Sasquatch could have found a poncho out there and put it on.
Well, that's possible. That's possible, yeah.
Now, that kind of leads me to another question. How sophisticated do you think the Bigfoot is? In the sense of tool using?
All of the eyewitnesses, except for a few spurious anecdotes that get thrown in there by, I think, people with an agenda. There is no reporting of fire use, of home bases, of tool use. There's no clothing. There's questionable language. Questionable interpretation of the presence of language. Certainly, they have a varied vocal repertoire, but I've yet to see convincing evidence that they have sophisticated language, articulate language, such as utilized by modern humans. So all those things point to, the realm of apedom or very early hominidness, if you will. I don't see anything that suggests that there's some forest people, that they are some form of primitive human, that they are, on par with a Neanderthal or even a Homo erectus in their material culture.
May it be a new species then?
Oh, certainly. I think. I mean, even if we could connect the dots, say back to Gigantopithecus blacki, enough time and enough distance separates those species those organisms that I think they would definitely be separate species. So certainly different than any species we currently know in existence today, and even from the fossil record, enough time has transpired and likely enough differences in adaptation that we would denote them with a different species designation.
And just for clarification purposes for myself, maybe even for my daughter, we were watching the other day, it's with the question dawned on me before the interview, we were watching Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and he had Bumble, the abominable snowman.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, well, is he the same as Bigfoot? Is Yeti the same? Are all these guys the same, or just different variations? Are they changed because of where they are, their environment?
No, I think that they're many of them are quite distinct species. Now, there are some that are more or less equivalent. The Chinese Yeren, for example, I had the privilege of going over and examining some footprint evidence attributed to this form of hominoid, and the footprints were indistinguishable from those of Sasquatch.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Is it
absolutely.
bipedal?
Oh, it definitely is bipedal, and with a foot just very similar, showing subtleties of anatomy and artifacts indicative of the movement of the foot when walking and squatting and so forth that are absolutely consistent with those that I have pointed out, those distinctions of the Sasquatch foot.
Can you indicate time as well from there? How long the foot has been there, the footprint?
Well, in this case, these were contemporary. These were recent. The footprint casts were made by a park ranger in central China in Hubei province, and he witnessed the individual, tracked him, and then returned with materials to make plaster casts of a couple of very clear footprints that were in the mud beside a spring. And so I've been collecting footprint evidence across Asia. So from China down through Southeast Asia, up through the foothills of the Himalayas and up around all the way to the Caucasus Mountains, there are examples of absolutely consistent Sasquatch footprints. So I think that species was once very widespread across Asia, and now is restricted to just fragmented refugia in its once former habitat. But when you look
confident that they're not hoaxes?
The majority of them, yeah, I'm quite confident, that they're not hoaxes. I mean, they're the ecological correlation. I mean, the places where these things have been found also attest, I think, to their credibility. But then compared to the Yeti, there's actually a very slim fossil record. A very slim footprint record for the Yeti, surprisingly.
Where's the Yeti?
The Yeti, the abominable snowman.
Oh, Bumble.
Bumble.
Where's he at?
They're in the high valleys of the Himalayas, and there's only one or two footprints that are potentially of a hominoid. Most footprints that have been attributed to the Yeti can either be explained as bear tracks, and that's B-E-A-R, not B-A-R-E, bear tracks, or they're just unintelligible. I mean, they're just pug marks that have been melted out, sublimation of the snow enlarged to the point that they're just completely ambiguous. When we come back to those two, the most widely known are the famous Shipton footprints that were photographed by Eric Shipton and Michael Ward on the Menlung Glacier in the Himalayas. Very interesting, kind of odd, and unfortunately they only snapped 2 photos of a single footprint. But the much more compelling but less popularized are the footprints from the McNeely Cronin expedition to the Aran Valley in the Himalayas, one of the highest temperate valleys in that mountain range, and they undertook a 2-year biological survey in that region, and during that time they encountered a long line of extremely clear, fresh footprints that looked, for all intents and purposes, like a big chimpanzee with a divergent big toe, and long, but not as long as a modern chimp, lateral digits, but suggesting that it's still, even though it's capable of bipedalism, just as we talked about last time about the facultative bipedalism of chimpanzees and Ardipithecus, it still preserves that divergent thumb-like big toe, which is indicative of tree climbing. So if these footprints are genuine, and this is the best case, and they are attributable to the Yeti, then the Yeti is a creature, an ape of these high temperate tropical to tropical, not tropical, but subtropical forested valleys, and their footprints are only seen out in the snowfields. Sorry about that. Their footprints, yeah. So even though some Yeti footprints are found in these high alpine passes, they don't live there. They are certainly creatures of the forest, and are utilizing resources that require them to climb in the trees, as attested to by their divergent big toe.
It's kind of funny because they're starting to remind me of Ben Laden here. I'm assuming they're hiding in these mountains, and they know we're trying to find them, but they keep hiding.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's just, there are lots of other very reclusive species that have taken that same strategy. The snow leopard, for example, the ghost cat, it's extremely hard to track and observe, and it's making use of these similar types of habitats. So
there's some humans that do the same thing, I guess.
That's right, yeah. There's some remote populations.
Now let's explore this. These are the questions that are going to put Dr. Meldrum on the hot seat here. Are we still evolving, you think?
We are. I think we are, in some ways, in certain ways. Whenever there is differential survival of individuals with particular characteristics, there will be a natural selection acting on that population of organisms. We have insulated ourselves to a great deal from the environment. If it's cold, we put on clothing or turn up the thermostat. If we can't see, we craft lenses to increase our visual acuity. We are able to manipulate the environment and augment our anatomy and physiology through these means, but when it comes to things like genes that make one more susceptible to heart disease, or that add a few decades of healthy longevity, or that makes one resistant to Ebola. Whenever there's a differential survival of individuals with particular characteristics that have contributed to that survival, then they will pass on those traits to the next generation, and we will continue to evolve.
It's good news. Good news.
The problem is, can we do it fast enough? That's the thing.
Before I pass,
subjecting the population to things at such a pace as we pollute and contaminate and overpopulate, that we may not be able, as a species, may not be able to react quickly enough to some of these stressors.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting look at the future. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll be around for that time, but my daughters will. So I hope it does stay healthy.
I know. That's the sobering thought as I contemplate the world that my kids will inherit from our generation.
The last few minutes here, I wanted to touch upon a couple things quickly. There was a video I saw a while back ago. I know we talked off camera about the chimpanzee that sharpened this little stick and was trying to skew himself some dinner through a tree. Is that an indication possibly of a chimpanzee that's evolving and leaving the other gang behind?
Well, it may be that. I think perhaps a better explanation is that we are coming to recognize the capabilities of hominoid species and all animal species for that matter, of expressing much greater degrees of intelligence and even cognition of their surroundings than we have given them credit in the past. There's ample evidence that chimpanzees have a level of culture. Different populations in different parts of Africa have different suites of characteristics and behaviors, whether it's using stones to crack open nuts or sharpening sticks to skewer something in a knot hole in a tree. All these things are quite distinctive of particular populations and of chimps, and are being passed on to the next generation through learning. They're not instinctive behaviors, but they're learned behaviors, and that, you know, whether there's evidence that that the chimps were able to observe evolution taking place in that sense, in the sense that you're alluding to, that this chimp is breaking out from its cohort, and it's the Caesar. It's the Caesar of the dawn of the Planet of the Apes. I'm not sure if we're to there yet, but what it does show, it also, as we come to better understand the spectrum of behaviors and the degree of intelligence, social intelligence, and manipulative intelligence that these creatures exhibit, we see the roots of our own behaviors, or at least the seeds of where they could have sprouted very easily under the proper selection pressures. And so our origins become less mysterious, I think, when we come to a better understanding and realization of the diversity that these creatures exhibit.
We have 2 minutes left. The key question, the question everybody's been waiting for probably for 2 shows. Does Bigfoot really exist, and is he still here?
Well, once again, I think they exist. Yes, I'm quite convinced on the basis of the evidence that they still exist. And yes, they are still here. I mean, we're having reports and sightings and footprint finds on an ongoing basis. I think, it's unclear whether they're an endangered species on the verge of extinction or not, but they're there. I'm quite convinced they're there.
Now, some speculate that Dr. Meldrum has Harry Henderson at his home. This is how he gets the inside information. Is this true?
If that were the case, I think I would probably retire from my day job, and I would pursue my other interests for a while here in my golden years. Hopefully they remain golden. So no, unfortunately, I don't have the
no Harry
brass ring at home. No.
And that actually leads us to the final question. I know you actually have an interesting project coming up, and can you tell us briefly, a sentence or two, of what that project is?
Yes. We talked a little bit about the significance of the discovery of Homo floresiensis, and it's interesting. Many of my colleagues, when that came to light, yes, exactly, the Hobbit. And they're one, for example, said when he heard the story of the Hobbit, he immediately thought of these legends of the Orang Pendek, the short man in Southeast Asia. Well, we're cultivating the potential to actually do some archaeological research in some of these areas and look for recent remains of these creatures. It'll be amazing if we walk out of a cave with a skeleton that's just a few hundred years old as opposed to tens of thousands of years old.
That would be amazing. Dr. Meldrum, if people want to learn more about you or read your fabulous books, if you really want some credible books on Bigfoot, I highly recommend Dr. Jeff Meldrum's books. Where do we go?
That's on my to-do list. One of my New Year's resolutions is to get a web page up for easy access to some of these things. But my books are available. My books and the field guide are available through Amazon.com, of course. You can find it that way. Or you can contact me directly if you have specific questions.
Wonderful.
My web page is up on the university web page, and I can be contacted with the information that's there.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Meldrum, for being on the circle. Thank you, everyone, as well, for joining us. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, we are there, even if it's in the Himalayas. See you next time, everyone.